So it's open. Oh, how about that? That's pretty cool. So that is through amy.e.buckingham@mcpsmd.net. So if there are people who aren't able to use the Instagram, all right, so I'm just waiting for your questions. We're down to 19, which is still quite a few of you, so there must be a few questions. You want to make sure that if you are looking at operant conditioning, and what you're looking at is behavior consequence. So you want to be able to distinguish between positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Positive, whether, no matter what you're talking about, remember, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's good or bad when you're positive and negative. You're talking about the addition or the removal. So positive reinforcement is the addition of something desirable. So maybe it's a reward, maybe it's a sticker, maybe it's candy, whatever it is that you want to enjoy, screen time. The idea being that any behavior that is followed by a desirable consequence will be repeated. That's what makes it a reinforcement. So the positive reinforcement, you get a treat, you get a reward, you get extra screen time, you get extra privileges, you get a treat if you're Midas. So poor dog, every time I say his name, his ears perk up. So positive reinforcement gets a behavior to continue and happen again. Negative reinforcement also gets a behavior to continue and happen again, because what it does is removes an aversive stimuli. So if your parents are hollering at you, clean your room, clean your room, clean your room, and you do it, you have just negatively reinforced your parents' behavior, because what we have learned is that in order to get you to clean your room, we nag you, we fuss at you. So negative reinforcement is the removal of an aversive stimuli to get a behavior to be repeated. You might, for example, put on your seatbelt, because putting on your seatbelt makes the sound of the dinging in the car stop. If you take Advil or Aleve and it gets rid of a headache, that's going to be an example of negative reinforcement, because you're removing the aversive stimuli of the pain in your head by taking that medication. So the next time your head hurts, you're going to take medication again. So whatever it was that has worked before. So that's an example of negative reinforcement. Now, reinforcement is going to get a behavior to continue, where punishment will get a behavior to stop. So theoretically, if you deliver positive punishment, what that shows is the addition of an undesirable consequence. It is not saying something is good. It's saying it's the addition of an undesirable consequence. So for example, positive punishment, spanking. Positive punishment, a parking ticket, a speeding ticket, a red light ticket. So positive punishment adds an undesirable consequence. Negative punishment removes a desirable consequence. So the removal of the desirable consequence should stop an undesirable behavior. So this is also called omission training. And we see it in examples of things like timeout, loss of privileges, the loss of anything that is desirable, screen time, your freedom to go out with your friends, the car, your cell phone. Anytime you lose something desirable, that is a negative punishment, the removal. So just keep that in mind. Anytime you're looking at positive and negative with reinforcement and punishment, reinforcement always gets a behavior to happen again. Punishment always gets a behavior to stop. Positive adds something in, negative removes it away, takes something away. So there you have a good bit with positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. Do you have any other questions? I'm not seeing. Oh, goodness gracious. What's the UCS and the sea snails example? Excellent. Okay, I'm sorry, guys. The sea snails example is the unconditioned stimuli. With the sea snails, that's the worst example in your textbook possible. However, here's what it is. The sea snails in the saltwater don't typically do anything. So but the shock, the electric shock, is something that is very painful. So if you splash water on a sea snail, it doesn't do anything to it. But if you pair the splash of the water with an electric shock, then these snails learn to be afraid of the splash of water. So you splash them with the water and they'll pull back into their shells, expecting the electric shock. So the short answer to that question, the UCS in the sea snails example is the UCS, the unconditioned stimuli, is what? It is the shock. Shock biologically causes the reaction. It's not learned. Okay, next question is fixed ratio and variable. So both of the ratio schedules are looking at per number. So for example, when you go to McDonald's and you buy 10 of their McCafe, the 11th one is free. When you go to 7-Eleven, the 7th or 8th or something cup is free. When you have a set number of stars, that fixed, you get something free. So that's a fixed ratio. Your variable ratio is every unpredictable number. So it might be today, it might be that it's 5 stars to get a prize, and tomorrow it'll be 8 stars. And it's not necessarily consistent. It's going to vary over time and it's unpredictable. Okay, now that takes you to making sure that you know the intermittent ratio and variable. So intermittent ratio is going to the variable ratio, the variable interval. You want to make sure you know the time ones as well. Ratio is numbers, interval, looking at time. So fixed interval is when you get a monthly present or a monthly reward or a weekly allowance, even if you don't do your chores. That's a fixed interval. If you get a fixed ratio, we already did that. We did the variable ratio. Variable ratio. We need fixed interval, and variable interval is unpredictable amount of time. So your unpredictable amount of time today, it might be 3 hours, where tomorrow it'll be 5 hours. Okay, what are Bandura and Thorndike responsible for? Bandura is social. He is looking at the idea of observational learning. Bandura is the one who specifically did the Bobo doll study with the kids and the bop bag. Thorndike, you definitely want to know Thorndike's law of effect. Thorndike's law of effect said that any behavior that is followed by a desirable consequence is likely to be repeated. Okay, and that kind of laid the groundwork for a lot of the learning studies. Hi, Jordan. What experiments should we know? You want to make sure you know Pavlov. You want to make sure you know, oh, good. I see some other good questions here. Bandura's study. You want to make sure you know Little Albert and the Watson study. Those are the main ones. You want to make sure you recognize Thorndike's law of effect, but there's nothing really in terms of a study to know for that. Mirror neurons are what enable us to copy other people, to mimic. So you might not be able to see because you're not on the YouTube stream, but if you were to copy what I'm doing, for example, if you're making hand gestures and you're copying what I'm doing, you're using your mirror neurons to do that. The mirror neurons help us learn by observing. Operant conditioning versus classical conditioning. When you are looking at, so I see several of your questions being about that. I am really sorry. These questions just popped up and they don't scroll. I have to actually scroll. I'm learning something new. So the different types of conditioning. When you're talking about classical conditioning, it is always about the pairing of stimuli. Operant conditioning is always about a behavior and a consequence. So if you are talking about something that's going to make you do something that you already do biologically, so you're going to salivate, or it's going to make you wince, or you're going to cry out in fear, or then you're talking about classical conditioning. If you are talking about operant conditioning, you're talking about behaviors and the consequence that follows. So, in order to get a behavior to repeat, you reinforce it. In order to get a behavior to stop, you punish it. Different types. See, that was, discrimination. Good question, Leah. Discrimination is when we learn over time that bells sound different. So in Pavlov's study, what happened was the dogs began to salivate at the sound of anything that sounded like a bell. That's what we call generalization. Over time, they learned that only a specific type of bell would signal the arrival of food. So that's discrimination. So what happened with little Albert is that he never learned discrimination. He generalized all of his fears. So everything that was white and fluffy became a source of fear for him. Unfortunately, we didn't know enough about discrimination and generalization in little Albert's day in order to help retrain him. So that poor kid, poor guy, never outgrew his fears. Experiments in people are most important to know. You want to make sure that you know Bandura, Pavlov, Watson, Thorndike, and their studies. In the dog experiment, the CR and the UCS, the conditioned response. CR is the conditioned response. And that's almost always going to be either the same or very, very similar to the unconditioned response. So in the dog experiment, that's the salivation. The deal is that it changes what you're salivating to. So with Pavlov's dogs, the conditioned response is the salivation at the sound of the bell. The unconditioned stimulus is the presentation of meat on the tongue or the food in the dog's mouth. The thing that naturally causes the dog to salivate is the unconditioned stimuli. The bell is the conditioned stimuli. Okay, intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. That's a really good question. Intrinsic motivation is when we do something because we like it. So if you go running, you're not on a team, and you go out for a run because it makes you feel better. You're doing that for intrinsic motivation. If, however, you go out for a run because your parents give you an extra serving of ice cream, or you get you get $1 for every mile that you've run, that is extrinsic motivation because you're doing something for a reward, something for an outside other reason. So when you're going to school and you're studying AP psychology, are you studying because it's really interesting? That's intrinsic motivation. If you're studying because you feel like you need to get a good grade so that you can get into a specific college, that is extrinsic motivation. So you need to be able to distinguish between the two, primarily for understanding the concept of over-justification. So what happens is if you reward something that someone is already intrinsically motivated for, then you run the risk of that person only doing the action for the extrinsic reward. So what happens is if you're, and the question in my class had to do with professional athletes, and doesn't that contradict the idea of over-justification? And the reality is it really doesn't. It actually shows you exactly how it works, because we are paying them to do something that they liked doing in their youth. And now Bryce Harper doesn't even have a home to pitch at, or at least he didn't this morning. I'm not sure if he does now, but things happen because they are now motivated by the dollar value, not because baseball is a really fun game to play. Spontaneous recovery is an excellent question. Spontaneous recovery refers to after a rest period or a pause in the presentation of the conditioned stimuli without the unconditioned stimuli. Then you take a break, and the conditioned response will increase again, because what happened is that you learned the association. So here's what happens. The dogs learn that the bell signals the arrival of the food. So they salivate every time they hear the bell. Well, then the more times you ring the bell and they don't get fed, the less they salivate. So then you take a break and say, okay, well, I'm not going to ring this bell at all until tomorrow. Then when you ring the bell tomorrow, they salivate more than they did at the end of the day yesterday. That's spontaneous recovery. So it's the second day you guys came back from the Pavlov lemonade experiment. And when I first said Pavlov, some of your mouths puckered and you could anticipate the feeling of the lemonade on your tongue. Feel free to keep asking questions. I'll stay on as long as you need me. There are 12 of you still in the chat, and as long as you have questions, I'll stay and answer for you. And then we can talk about whether or not this is helpful. So any questions that you have, and I'll post the video at the end so that you can take a look at the video and see if there were any questions that were answered already that you were interested in. Different types of behaviors. Tell me what you mean by different types of behaviors. Are you asking about operant? Or are you asking about specifically reinforcing and punishing? Biological predispositions, yes. So Lindy Troxel, come back to me with the different types of behaviors. Tell me exactly what you're trying to ask so I can answer that. Can I explain the biological predisposition? Yes. It's important for us to realize and recognize, particularly when it comes to animal training, that we have to act within an animal's biological predispositions if we want those learning principles to work. So think about the pigeon. One of the things that Skinner did was trained pigeons to peck on a target. So that's not something you're necessarily born needing or wanting to do. But he's trying to get them to do something that they already do. And you can't teach them something, you can't get them to do a behavior that they are not biologically predisposed to do. So that biological predisposition is about tapping into what the animal naturally does. So I'm not going to be able to teach my darling dog to fly. I can teach him to lay here on the floor and sleep. I can teach him to do things that he is capable of doing, but he does not have the biological ability to fly. So he's not going to be able to learn how to do that. He does not have the biological ability to form words. He's not going to be able to learn how to talk. Now, if he had a different structure in his mouth, he might be able to form words, but he doesn't. So there's your biological predisposition. Okay, back to the question about different types of behaviors, operant and respondent. Yes. So here's what that's referring to. Respondent behaviors is taking a look at classical conditioning and the biological response. So that's what we call it when we are looking at the classical conditioning. So it's a natural behavior. So in all of the cases we've looked at, you're talking about things like salivation, the fear response, the behavior that is the biological action that our bodies take in reaction to something. And then they can become in reaction to something that we didn't already biologically connect. So the dogs and the bell, when they salivated to the sound of the bell, that's not a behavior that they're born knowing, but it is the respondent behavior because it's what they have paired. It's what they learn to expect. Okay. Rachel, you're asking if there's anything that we need to turn in tomorrow before the test. I am collecting the crossword puzzle and the multiple choice questions that are stapled to that crossword puzzle for homework tomorrow. The other activities, you have until midnight tomorrow night to submit the cell phone addiction article response, and I did clarify a lot of the directions in that. So if you haven't already turned it in, you can go back and read the directions again, and it'll hopefully be pretty clear this time. Hey, Tristan, how are you doing, buddy? It's a lot quieter on this one than it was on the last one. Which schedule has the highest rate of response? That's a really good question. And the short answer is, what do you mean by highest? If you're talking about the fastest learning, the very fastest learning is going to occur with continuous reinforcement. The problem with that is that continuous reinforcement also is subject to faster extinction. If I reward the behavior every single time it's exhibited, then when I stop reinforcing it, the behavior is going to stop a lot faster. So if I'm looking for a short-term learning curve, I'm going to use continuous reinforcement. But if I am looking for the long term, I'm going to use the process of shaping. And that's going to take me through a couple of the different reinforcement schedules. So what I might see, for example, is in the beginning, I'll use a fixed ratio. That is your fastest learning within the different possibilities of interval, of intermittent reinforcing. And then what I might do is switch it over to either a variable ratio or a variable interval so that I shape the desired behavior. So the next question, what do we need to know about Skinner? You need to be able to associate Skinner as with being the big founder, the big contributor to operant conditioning. Skinner had an operant chamber where the rats pressed the bar and it delivered a food pellet. So that's another, takes you back to the other person's question about biological predisposition. So the fact that the rat was able to press the bar relied upon the rat's ability to pull their front paws up and reach for the bar. If you put it too far out of their range, they couldn't get it. So you want to make sure you know that with Skinner, you're talking about operant conditioning, behavior, consequence. And with that, the rats would learn that you press the bar, you get a food pellet. Hi, buddy. No, this one is nobody's on. It's the YouTube, so that's fine.
Can I take this?
Sure. You have to end the stream on that, and then you can take my computer.